some of the other letters that we've covered, especially First and Second Corinthians, where it's just kind of, Paul trying to correct one problem after another and address this issue and that issue and this behavior and that false doctrine and that kind of thing. We don't really have that in Philippians. Now, it's not that he doesn't address any problem areas or potential problem areas or false teachings, but it's very different from his letters to the church in Corinth because he's not writing to try and fix a bunch of problems that are going on in the church. Okay, so as we think about Philippians, it's kind of a letter that, it doesn't dwell on problems in the church there. And it is, as we might think of it, it's more encouraging to think about where they're at from that standpoint compared to how the Corinthians had a lot that they had to work on and correct. So that's something that stands out to us. Anything else that, when you think of Philippians, you think, well, this is what comes to mind for me? All right.
Yes. That helps us focus on Jesus because he embodies all of those.
So especially chapter 4, those passages in chapter 4 that talk about rejoicing in the Lord, being anxious for nothing, going to God in prayer, meditating on good things, all of that. Philippians chapter 4 is such an encouraging chapter in that regard, and that may be what comes to mind first and foremost when we think about this particular letter, is all of those things that we're supposed to focus on, especially when we're in the midst of turmoil or difficulties or things that would make us anxious. Any other thoughts? All right, we'll see the connection that Paul had with them in the work that he was doing, and the support of that work is something that is very much emphasized here. And of course, there's one little word that comes up again and again, or a form of it, a 3-letter word that is often associated with Paul's letter to the church in Philippi. J-O-Y. Rejoicing or joy. Numerous times that word or a form of that word is used throughout the letter. And so that may be something that we can latch on to or that comes to mind when we think about Philippians. This idea of joy and rejoicing. And we'll talk about that more as we move forward. And so as we look at this book, let's start in chapter 1, as we often do, and looking at the title and the origin of this book. Let's go ahead and read here in Philippians chapter 1. Eli, can I get you to take that for us? Verses 1 and 2, please. Here's our opening greeting, and the title of the book it's designated as the Epistle of Paul the Apostle to the Philippians. And as we look at the first couple of verses here, okay, so to whom is this addressed? Which Philippians in particular are addressed here? Okay, the church in Philippi. Okay, so Philippi is a city. And you have which people addressed in particular? We say the church, but he calls them what? The saints. Okay, the saints. Does anybody have anything different from saints there in the version you're reading from? Okay, so what are saints?
The saved.
Okay, the saved, right? The sanctified ones. That's what saints means, right? Those that are set apart to God. And so saints in the New Testament is a synonym for Christians, right? Christians, believers, the faithful, those that are saved. Okay, so it's to the saints who are in Philippi. And here's Paul's opening greeting and salutation to them. And you'll notice how does this describe a properly organized local church in the way that he addresses them here? What description does he give of these people that he's writing to? It's a group of saints. All right, and then he mentions with the bishops and deacons, or as Eli's version that he read from puts it, the overseers and deacons. Okay, so what are bishops? Okay, elders, right? We have those interchangeable terms that are used in the New Testament. Right? We've got bishops or overseers. That's one word that's translated into two words in English. Right? And then we have elders, right? Or presbyters, pastors, shepherds, right? All those are the same thing, just different descriptive terms for the same thing in the New Testament. Okay, so this church had men who were in its midst who were serving as overseers of the church, elders or bishops or pastors, overseers, shepherding the flock. And then he also mentions deacons. What are deacons? What's another word for deacon? Servants. That's what that word means. Okay, and so in a formal sense, you have these ones who are in the midst of this church, or part of this group, some who are designated to oversee it, and then others who are designated in special ways to serve it. Bishops and deacons, overseers and deacons. Okay? So when we look at that, it's interesting because this is the only one of the letters of Paul written to a church that begins that way. Okay, so that indicates to us that, probably not every church was fully organized in that way. For whatever reason, here, this one was, and Paul addresses this group of saints, including its elders and its deacons that serve in its midst. So not every church was blessed to be at that full capacity like the church in Philippi was. So what does that tell you about the church in Philippi at this time?
Strong in faith and beliefs and.
All right, yeah, it's an indication of strength, isn't it? It's an indication of strength because we recognize that, based on other things that we see in the New Testament, not just anybody can serve as an overseer or a deacon. You have to be of certain character and have certain qualities in order to be able to be in that position. You've got to be mature in the faith and you've got to be faithful and sound and all of those things. And so it's a position of strength to be in for this church to be organized in this way. It's a good sign. Roman soldiers and officials. Yeah, different kind of a city, different kind of location, and right, probably in some ways a different demographic as far as who makes up this city and by extension the church there. And so it is an indication of strength and maturity and those kinds of things when we see that here's a church that's operating with its own elders and deacons, and Paul addresses it that way. Okay, so that's important to notice as we look at the situation here and the way that Paul writes to this congregation. Now, looking at Philippi, the city, okay, it's located in Greece, right? And so Corinth is down here in the southern part of Greece in the province of Achaia. Philippi is up here in Macedonia to the north. And it was a Roman colony that afforded it, special rights. Not every place was a Roman colony. As Neil mentioned, you would have, maybe retired Roman soldiers or officials that would, settle there, that kind of thing, because it had that status. And so a little bit of a different kind of a situation than some of the other places that we come across in the New Testament. But it's estimated that, it might have had 500,000 people in population during the first century, during the time of the apostles. So a sizable city, somewhere from 200,000 to 500,000 inhabitants, perhaps at that time. And a wealthy city. There were gold mines, fertile soil for farming, those kinds of things. And so a prosperous kind of place as we think about the resources that it would have had at that time. And so that's kind of a little bit of background about this city where this church is located. And now as we think about the authorship of this book, as we already read, who's writing this letter? Paul. And who's with him at the time? Timothy. Okay, so he includes Timothy there in the address and the greeting there in chapter 1 and verse 1, which is not unusual. We see that a lot in Paul's writings, that he'll include Timothy and sometimes someone else who is with him at the time, including that person and giving this greeting to the church there. And as we think about Paul and his authorship of this letter, let's think about some of the things that are said within the letter. How do these passages help to support Paul's authorship here? Let's just run through these, okay? Let's notice some things here. Chapter 1, John, can you take for us chapter 1 and verse 7? And then could you skip down and read also verse 13? All right. So what do you see in those verses that ties in with what we know about Paul? A couple things stand out there. Start with the easy one first. How about verse 13 that John just read for us?
He's in prison.
He's in prison. He's in chains. He's in prison. Okay? And so we know that's characteristic of what we know about Paul, especially as we've already looked at in the book of Acts, right? How does the book of Acts end? What's the last thing we see at the end of the book of Acts in Acts chapter 28? Paul is under house arrest in Rome as a prisoner. And he's in chains for Christ. He's taken to Rome as a prisoner. Okay, so there's a definite connection in how he describes himself there. And you'll notice in chapter 1 and verse 13 and what John just read for us, what does he say about this imprisonment? How does he connect it to where he's located? Palace guard, the Praetorian Guard. Well, where is that? That's Rome, right? That's where that is. Okay, so he's right there where Caesar is. And so, there's a definite connection. We know that's where Paul was at the end of the book of Acts. That's how he describes his condition here. But then there's also, as we back up to what we read in verse 7, what else do we see as far as Paul and the church in Philippi? How does he describe that connection?
He's got them in his heart. He feels for them, but while he's still in prison, so he's still got a great deal of compassion and understanding for them.
All right, he's got a great deal of compassion and understanding for them. He's got them in his heart. Why does he have these people in his heart? Has he been there? Does he know them personally?
Yes.
Who started the church in Philippi? So we go back to Acts chapter 16 on Paul's second journey. And at the beginning of Paul's second journey in Acts chapter 16, as he started out, first of all, who did he take with him on that second journey? This is the one where he and Barnabas split up. Silas, right? He took Silas, and then at the beginning of the journey, they picked up another young man to go with them the rest of the way. Who was that? The one that we just saw addressed here at the beginning of the book from Philippians, Timothy, right?
Timothy.
So you got Paul and Silas and Timothy going to Philippi, right? And then along the way, they pick up Luke, presumably, because we start to see one of those we sections in the book of Acts where the writer is among the travelers. Okay, so you have that group of men that go to Philippi, and Lydia and her household are baptized. Paul and Silas get put in prison, and as a result of that, the jailer and his household are baptized. Right, so you see the beginning of the church happening there in Philippi in Acts chapter 16, and you got Paul and Timothy are right there in the middle of that beginning, and here they are sending this letter now to the church in Philippi later on. And so, yes, Paul has them in his heart. I mean, he was there, he was involved in starting the church there, he was beaten and imprisoned, and they didn't turn their backs on him. Even at the end of Acts chapter 16, when he and Silas get out of prison, they go straight to Lydia's house. She takes them back in, and before they go on their way. And so you can understand how there would be a very close connection between Paul and the church in Philippi, based on how he was part of its beginning in such a key way there, and brought the gospel to that city and that Roman colony. All right, how about let's move on to chapter 2 and look at another connection that we see in what Paul describes here. Chapter 2, Neil, can I get you to take for us chapter 2, verses 19 to 23, if you would?
But I trust in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you shortly. I also may be encouraged when I know your state. For I have no one like-minded who will sincerely care for your state. So all seek their own, not the things which are of Christ Jesus. But you know his proven character, that as a son with his father, he served me in the gospel. Therefore, I hope to send him at once, as soon as I see how it goes.
All right. So, couple things here. What kind of condition is Paul in? Can he just pick up and go where he wants to? No, again, he's in prison, right? He can't just go to Philippi himself, but he can send somebody else who's with him, and who's that? Timothy. How does he describe Timothy here? Like a son, right? And we see that again and again. That very, very much fits what we know about Paul and Timothy and their relationship. He describes Timothy that way time and again in the New Testament as a son in the faith, right? Serving together like father and son. Not that they literally were father and son, but that close spiritual bond, the older man Paul, the younger man Timothy, and that father and son kind of relationship they had in working together to further the gospel. And so that comes out again here. Paul can't go right now, but Timothy, who's like-minded, who's on the same page as he is, he can send him to go and encourage the church there in Philippi. Okay, so that's very characteristic of what we see and know about Paul throughout the New Testament writings. Okay, and then let's look at chapter 3. Chapter 3, and AJ, let me get you to read chapter 3 and verses 1 through 7, if you wouldn't mind taking that whole section, please.
Finally, my brothers, rejoice in the Lord. To write the same things to you is no trouble to me, and is safe for you. Look out for the dogs, look out for the evildoers, look out for those who mutilate the flesh. For we are the circumcision, who worship by the Spirit of God and glory in Christ Jesus, and put no confidence in the flesh. Though I myself have no reason for confidence. If anyone else thinks he has reason for confidence in the flesh, I have more. Circumcised on the 8th day of the people of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin, a Hebrew of Hebrews, as to the law, a Pharisee, as to zeal, a persecutor of the church, as to righteousness under the law, blameless. But whatever gain I had, I counted as loss for the sake of Christ.
All right. So you look at this description here. Now he's giving them a warning. Watch out. Basically, watch out for these false teachers, right? These Judaizing teachers that are trying to say you got to be circumcised, you got to become a Jew to be saved, you Gentiles. Again, the warning about that. But notice how he describes himself. What description is given here that we know about Paul from other passages in the New Testament? How does he describe himself? What is his background?
When he was the
Right, persecutor of the church. That's what he had been, right, before he was converted to Christ. Okay, and of course we come across that in the book of Acts, and then the way he refers to himself in other passages. What else?
I'm a Hebrew of Hebrews, the stock of Israel, of the tribe of Benjamin. I mean, just basically,
All right.
his pedigree is top
Yeah,
notch.
that Jewish heritage, right? The tribe he's from, the Jewish party he's from. He was a Pharisee, and with all those things that he describes there, and keeping the law and being blameless according to the law, and yet, what else does he go on to say about all that? What did he do with all that? Gave it up, left it behind, counted it, lost for Christ. I want to follow Christ, so none of that matters anymore. And so, again, very consistent with what we see with the change that took place in Paul's life and his focus compared to the background that he had and where he started. Okay, so, a number of personal things here that we can connect with Paul. And then it's interesting as we think about his connection with the church there and in the description that he gives. Look at chapter 4. Chapter 4. Jamari, let me get you to read Philippians 4 and just verse 1.
Therefore, my brethren, dearly beloved and longed for, my joy and crown, so stand fast in the Lord, my dearly beloved.
Look at the way he describes this church. Twice in that one verse, he calls them beloved. And he refers to them as his joy and his crown. And he longs for them. What does that tell you about this church?
Well-established, a loving church, I would
Yeah.
say.
Yeah, well-established, loving church, very dear to him. It looks like they're not a source of stress to Paul like some of the others were at times, right? They're not a source of frustration or anxiety to him. It's like this group of saints brings me peace, right? When I think about them, there's a peace in my heart as I consider this church, these brethren, the strength that is there, the comfort that is there. Not that Paul plays favorites with different ones, but he refers to these as his joy and crown. That this is a church that's doing what it's supposed to be doing, and they've proven themselves in that way.
And that goes back to the comment where he says he has them in his heart,
Right.
because he's talking about his persecution. It's worth going through what he's going through, knowing
Yeah.
how successful they are.
Yeah.
So it's a great source of encouragement when, okay, I'm dealing with a lot right now, but it's so worth it because look what you're like.
That's a good way to put it, right? That this is a success story here, right? Some of the other situations that Paul had to deal with, a little bit difficult, a little bit frustrating. This is a success story. And so here he's confined in Rome, and yet as he thinks about these brethren in Philippi, it's a comforting thought to think about them. They're a joy and they're a crown and they're beloved and they're dear to him. And it's a success story as he thinks about this group of saints in Philippi.
And I think here too is you mentioned the word joy or joyful. This is where it really brings home. They were joyful about the things they were doing, enjoyed it. So
Yeah.
I know if I've ever had to do something and it turned out really good, man, you felt good about it. You were
Right.
joyous about it. So
Yeah.
good thing.
That's the sense that we get here, right? And that's so key to the background of this and the things that he writes to them. All right, so as we look at the date here of this letter and the things that are being talked about here, and let's just notice a few passages here that help us to determine the time and place of the writing of this letter. We've already looked at some of this, but let's notice a little bit of additional. Going back again to chapter 1. Okay. Let's notice chapter 1. And let's read here chapter 1. Let's back up to chapter 1 and verse 3. Okay. Nathan, let me get you to pick up there. You can read chapter 1, 3 through 7.
Very thing that the one who began a good work in you will perfect it until the day of Christ Jesus. For it is right for me to think this all about all of you, because I have you in my heart, since both in my imprisonment and in the defense and confirmation of the gospel of you became partners in God's grace together with me.
All right. So the things that we were just talking about come through loud and clear there, don't they? Here, Paul, he's thankful for them. He thanks God for them. He has them in his heart. And, there's this connection that they have and their work together. And yet, he is in chains. So as we mentioned, that meshes well with what we read at the end of the book of Acts, that this is being written during that period of time when he's a prisoner in that first imprisonment in Rome that we read about in Acts 28. And so as we think about that, this is, we have these, what we call prison epistles. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon, all fitting into that time frame when Paul is a prisoner in that first Roman imprisonment. And then skip down to chapter 1 and verse 13. Chapter 1 and verse 13. And let's notice what he says about that situation. Let's read 13 and 14. Jana, can you take that for us, please? Chapter 1, 13 and 14.
But I want you to know, brethren, that the things which happened to me have actually turned out for the furtherance of the gospel, so that it has become evident to the whole palace guard and to all the rest that my chains are in Christ.
All right. So he talks about what's happened to him. Well, what is it that's happened to him since he was with the church in Philippi? What's happened now in the meantime? Yeah, he was arrested in Jerusalem when the mob tried to kill him at the temple, and he got taken because he's a Roman citizen. He got taken to Caesarea, and then he got shipped out to Rome to appeal to Caesar, and he's a prisoner. And so all these things have happened to him. But what does he say about that? That's contributed to what?
Furtherance of the
The
gospel.
furtherance of the gospel. So, he's kind of updating them on how things have gone as a result of all of that, looking at it from a positive perspective there. And so, yes, he's a prisoner in Rome, but that doesn't mean that, his work of spreading the gospel has stopped. And it's interesting when we get to the end of the letter in chapter 4, again, connecting this with him being a prisoner in Rome, in chapter 4, Evan, just read verses 22 and 23.
All the saints greet you, but especially those who are of Caesar's household. Grace of our Lord Jesus Christ be with you all. Amen.
So where is Caesar's household? That's in Rome. That's where that is, right? And so again, that's where he is when he's writing this, and he's offering a greeting there from saints who are in Caesar's household, which is an interesting thing in and of itself, that there would be Christians even in Caesar's household. Who was the Caesar at this time? You know who the Caesar was? Nero. What kind of guy was Nero?
Brutal.
The worst of the worst, right? And shortly after this, I mean, he would raise a persecution against Christians, you know, as some of the ancient Roman historians tell us, when Rome burned, you know, there was this idea that Nero burned it on purpose so he could build back better the way he wanted to. And people started, you know, think of it in those terms. He deflected it onto the Christians and had them persecuted and blamed them for it, which of course was not the case, but inflicted this terrible persecution. That's who this is. And yet there were saints even in Caesar's household at that time. What are your thoughts?
Before Rome burned, Nero wasn't so bad.
Went pretty psychotic, right? And yeah, it just boggles the mind, some of the things that he did and the atrocities that he committed. It really went downhill from that point. So as we put all of this together and put it on our timeline, as we like to do with each of these books, okay, so we have the Old Testament scriptures, of course, being completed, and then this 400-year period before Christ comes, where they're waiting for him to come. Jesus comes and arrives in the scene, and his death and resurrection takes place somewhere around 30 AD, as far as we can tell, somewhere in that time frame. And then we have the Apostle Paul going out on his preaching journeys. Okay, well, we put the destruction of Jerusalem by Rome in 70 AD. That's after Nero, after Nero's death, during the reign of Vespasian. But we have Paul's journeys taking place prior to that, and that second journey of Paul that we were talking about earlier, where he took Silas and Timothy and Luke, and they went to Philippi, and the church was started there. That's somewhere in that window of 49 to 52. So again, very compressed window of time. And we're only about 20 years after the death and resurrection of Jesus. A couple decades later, and this church in Philippi is started. Okay? And then we have Paul being taken as a prisoner to Rome, and he's there for 2 years during that first Roman imprisonment. The end of the book of Acts tells us. Now, we don't know exactly which 2 years, but it's somewhere in that 59 to 62 window is that 2-year imprisonment of Paul in Rome. And so you look at, you know, from the time the church in Philippi was started to the time that Paul is a prisoner in Rome, and he's writing this letter back to the church in Philippi, that church has been in existence maybe about 10 years, maybe about a decade. So again, short period of time here, and you see this church that it's got its own elders and deacons, and it's clicking along in its work, and there's maturity here, and faithfulness and strength. And so it's been in existence for about 10 years, and Paul, you know, has these fond feelings for the church there, and an appreciation for the work and the good that they're doing, and especially in partnership with him, even under difficult circumstances. So that's where we're at when Paul is writing this letter to the church of Philippi, and that's how long this church has been around at this point.
And boy, do we not have any excuses to complain about anything. I love listening or reading how much joy Paul gets just from, you know, how healthy this group is here. And it helps get him through the trials that he
And that's that's the thing, right? That's the thing that we want to mention as we think about, again, the emphasis on joy and rejoicing and talking about how much joy they bring him and how he thinks about them. What's the irony in all of that? He is in prison. He's in chains. He's not a free man, right? He doesn't know what awaits him here. And yet he can write about joy and rejoicing and how fondly he thinks of these brethren. So there's the ironic nature of this, that you can be in these hard, difficult circumstances with an uncertain outcome, and yet you can also have joy and rejoicing and talk openly about that. Why? How does that work?
He's looking forward to your salvation and his.
Yeah, it's all about
Connect this to Hebrews chapter 12, because it's about being Christ-like.
Yeah.
The joy that was set before him, not for what's going on right now. It's different from temporary happiness.
Yeah, that's the distinction, right? It's not this temporary happiness that's based on my external circumstances where I'm up one day and down the next. The joy is deeper than that, that here it's all about Christ. It's all about their salvation, his salvation, right? What lies ahead, the resurrection that he talks about in chapter 3, and the reward that awaits. And that's where that deep, abiding joy comes through, even for somebody who's in this situation.
We've been having these classes on the characteristics of Christians and talking about being loving, compassionate, tenderhearted, and how all of that should not be focused on us,
Yeah.
but it should be focused on others. And by doing that, we are given a great gift
Yeah.
of joy. And in this case, it's of joy. The joy, not focusing on what all we have. Oh, I'm blessed or I'm not blessed, but how are others being blessed, and how I can, by looking at them having a better life, be encouraged.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a great illustration of that. Looking at things from a spiritual perspective, the eternal, big picture kind of perspective here, looking at it through the lens of Christ, right? That's the way that things are being viewed.
And one thing that we sometimes do, and I've done it, and I think it's appropriate in the right situation, is we'll say things in our prayers like, thank you for how much you bless us, especially in this country. And we think of it that way because of all the physical things. But if we take away this country, that doesn't matter. It's like we've been blessed so much for the cause of Christ, because of what he's done for us spiritually. And if we're sitting somewhere in a hut with nothing, we should still be able to pray that prayer, regardless of whether we're in this country or not. And I realize I understand why we do it and why I've said it, but sometimes we need to throw that away for a moment and just say, thank you for the salvation.
Yeah, it's all about that, right? It's all about salvation, whether we have everything that we want as far as material blessings or not. The biggest things need to be in place, and that's Paul recognizes his physical circumstances are not ideal, but the most important things are in place for him, for the Philippian brethren. That's what matters, and that's the emphasis. That's the cause for rejoicing. All right, thank you for that good input and discussion. We're kind of slowing things down, take a little more time with some of these letters instead of trying to rush through, but I appreciate all the good input tonight. We'll pick up there and move on from there, Lord willing.